one of our indigenous friends would say, we have, so much from the Manhattan Project and all kinds of nuclear waste, too. I hope he's going to touch on that. But certainly the Kings Bay plowshares and all the threat of the new generation of nuclear weapons and stuff. So, which my mind rejects it all. Just the thought.
Jim, I was with Reverse the Trend folks today. We presented over at Gonzaga High School with Marshallese activists on Marshall Islands.
Wonderful. Wow.
Everywhere is beginning to rise in understanding and muscle up. I love it when you find young folks who have some sense. And I love what one of the things I know Vincent always talks about is the lens in which one sees their connection. Mm-hmm. And I think that's hugely important because there isn't a one-size-fits-all in bringing forth this issue. And I think that's been one of the lackings in organizing. As it's understood from one lens, it's fine, but you still got to show the relationship and through the lens that people are related to. And I know it can be done. It's just it's sort of like what one of the faith books says: the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And
right,
we'll get there though.
Facebook is ready if you're ready.
We're ready. Okay.
Step one is for you to throw the silver switch.
Yep.
Is the light on over your shoulder?
It is.
Put the clapper in front of your face. When you hit the clapper, you're on the air.
Welcome to Talking Peace, being produced here at Think Twice Radio in the home of the future, thanks to our excellent producer, Richard Wicca, and also as a show for WBNY, the original alternative at Buff State. So we're here with our special guest, Vince Intondi, hi, Vince.
Hey.
Hi. Very grateful that you're here. Vince is an author, a scholar. He's with Montgomery, of course, Montgomery University College. With Montgomery College, and has written a wonderful book called African Americans and the Bomb, Against the Bomb. And we're very excited to hear from him. So we're going to let him go ahead and present, and then we'll be here to, and we're very excited to hear from him. So we're going to let him go ahead and present.
He has a PhD in African American Studies,
and we're very excited to hear from him.
So we're say is qualified in these issues of nuclear concerns, and personally, it excites me, and I think that's one of the things that positions him so uniquely to write as he's written in his book. He is a book.
Well, we're more than honored, which is why I was rushing to hear what you can say, what you will say, because we have so much to learn, and it's such a very threatening issue. So Jim Anderson is here. I am here, Deidra EmEl, the executive director. We're all very thrilled, and you people at home to really learn about this just critically important issue. So thank you so much, Vince, for coming. Please. We're honored.
So thanks for having me. Always glad to be anywhere speaking with my family here, Jim Anderson, who always walks the walk. I'm thankful to Buff State and anybody that's out there listening tonight. I am a professor of history. I teach African American history and U.S. history at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is right outside of D.C. And I'm also the director of our Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement. Before that, I was also director of research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. And so my research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. And I got to this point most of my life as as an activist and as an academic really was revolving around the Black freedom movement. I was focused on issues of police brutality, criminal justice reform, and so on. And nuclear weapons, like a lot of young kids, really wasn't on my radar. I looked at them as very abstract. They had nothing to do with me. Nobody would be crazy enough to use them. And that started to change for me the first time that I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I went in 2005 and met with atomic bomb survivors, went to the ceremonies, went to the museums, spent quite a bit of time there. And I was filled with so much guilt and rage and anger about what my country had done that when I came back, I remember thinking to myself, how do I combine these two issues that I'm so passionate about, eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons? And I began by asking one question, which was, what did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And many people said that I wasn't going to find much in my research because African Americans were too busy trying to gain their own freedom and equality and didn't really care about this issue. And it would certainly be understandable, but they were wrong. African Americans care deeply about this issue. Now, of course, nothing's monolithic. We're not speaking for the entire Black community. But, when you look at Black history specifically, you have to understand that, as you know, for so long, this history, this narrative has been written by white, racist Southern males for so long. That's who wrote the textbooks, that's who wrote the books, that's who taught, and so on and so forth. So it really wasn't until the late 1960s. It wasn't until the Black Studies movement, the Black Arts movement, people like Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni and so many others that students demanded learning this history from their point of view. Right, learning their history and this is when we see the rise of Chicano studies and Native American studies and African American studies. And so when I look at African American history, I look at it as a giant brick wall, and we're still filling in those bricks. Right. And this issue with nuclear weapons is a giant missing brick that I wanted to hopefully fill in. And the goal in writing the book, too, was that hopefully those that are interested in Malcolm X and Huey Newton and, Solomon Coretta Scott King and others would come to this book and then learn about the nuclear issue. And those that were coming at it from a nuclear policy or a peace studies background would then learn about, folks like Lorraine Hansberry and others that they didn't know were interested in this issue. And so that was the goal, that I hoped to accomplish when I wrote this book. And so my research looks at those African-American activists who consistently argued that nuclear disarmament, colonialism, and the Black freedom movement were inextricably linked. They were looking at this through a different lens, through largely the lens of race. And so one of the first things that I found in this research was a story about Malcolm X. So in June of 1964, there was a group of atomic bomb survivors that were on a world peace study mission. And they were traveling around the world with other peace activists. And when they got to the United States, the woman that set up their visit was Yuri Kochiyama, the amazing Japanese-American activist who has now since passed. And she was friends with Malcolm. And she said to the survivors, while you're here in New York and in the country, what is it that you want to do most? And they all said, meet Malcolm X.
Wow.
But of course, at the time, Malcolm was traveling. He was in Africa and the Middle East. And so Yuri Kochiyama started writing letters to Malcolm and didn't think that he ever got them. And the last day, she was having a reception in her apartment in Harlem, and there was a knock at the door. When she answered the door, it was Malcolm. And Malcolm said to the atomic bomb survivor, you got hit with a bomb, or we got hit with a bomb too, called racism. And he spent the day talking with them about how racism and colonialism and the Vietnam War and nuclear weapons, how these things were all inextricably linked. Because Malcolm understood what so many before him understood, that the issue really wasn't civil rights, it was universal human rights. And so when you start to look at this issue, when the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima on August 6th and 3 days later on Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people of color, the U.S., the immediate reaction by the majority of this country was celebration. Gallup ran a poll a week after the atomic bombing in which 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan. A Roper poll at the same time showed that 22% of the American public hoped that Japan wouldn't surrender so that we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American people criticizing or questioning Truman's decision. And a lot of that early criticism came from the atomic scientists themselves, other religious communities, and the African American community. And that was because in this country, we had a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that is unprecedented, far worse than even the racism we saw towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. After Pearl Harbor, the motto of the Marines was, remember Pearl Harbor, keep them dying. General Joseph Stilwell wrote a letter in which he said, quote, when I think of how these bow-legged cockroaches have ruined our calm lives, it makes me want to wrap Jap guts around every lamppost in Asia. So there was, and it wasn't just, we were very careful in our literature. We separate Nazis from Germans. We separate Italians from fascists, but not Japan. They were all guilty for Pearl Harbor. Didn't matter. And so they're viewed as monkeys and they're viewed as vermin and cockroaches. And so again, we know that formula. When you take a people of color and you make them less than human, you otherize them, it makes it easier to commit violence against them. And this goes all the way back to slavery, right? We do this with slaves. We do this with Native Americans. We do this here with Japanese. We do it with immigrants. When you make that leap and you start calling them aliens, then they're not fully human. And then it makes it easier to say, well, you can kill them all on the border or kill them all, and put kids in cages because they're not really human. We do the same thing with people in the Middle East. We threaten to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam and Korea. It's always the same thing. Take a group of people of color, make them less than human. The Palestinian people, the same thing, and it makes it easier to say just kill them all. But this wasn't the case. This wasn't the case in many in the black community. They didn't agree with this. And part of this was because before the bomb was ever dropped, there was an affinity already built in many parts of the black community in the United States with the people of Japan. And that is because, for many reasons. One is, during Japanese internment, there were many African Americans that saw this and said, here's a group of people that committed no crime but are being put in these concentration camps, these internment camps, just for the color of their skin. This can happen to us. And we find instances where it's African Americans sneaking food and clothes and medicine into those internment camps. W.E.B. Du Bois had gone to Asia and had written about it and had been lionized in Asia. You had groups like, Elijah Muhammad, who would later become the leader of the Nation of Islam. They still to this day refer to themselves as, quote, the Asiatic black man, and believe that, so many Africans came from Asia. And in addition to that, when Ethiopia was invaded in 1935 by Mussolini in Italy, it wasn't the United States. It was actually Japan who publicly came out and said they were going to come to the aid of their colored brothers and sisters. And many in the U.S. knew that. So some of that affinity was already built in before the bomb was ever dropped. And so the first place that I started looking was African-American newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American. And overwhelmingly, I found a criticism of this decision or an apocalyptic narrative warning that the genie's out of the bottle, that we're not going to be able to control this. And it wasn't just the columnists. I went through and looked at letters to the editor, beauty shop owners, truck drivers, etc., to see what their thoughts were. And I found a common thread there of being critical of the decision to use nuclear weapons. And again, looking at it through the lens of race. I looked at African-American pastors at the time. What were their sermons? And again, you saw the same type of thing. So I was trying to find as many different places that I could look for this instead of just the known kind of cast of characters we think of, right? And some of the earliest, Langston Hughes actually was the first to publicly come out and question Truman's own racism in the decision. He writes in the Chicago Defender, questioning, why did you not drop it on Germany? Why did you not drop it on Italy? Why are people from Japan? And he was right to do so because Truman wasn't the most racist president we ever had. We might have just got done with that, but certainly one of the most. Truman had a deep-seated racism. If you go look at any of his letters to his wife Bess or his own diaries, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. He admits in one letter to his wife that, quote, yellow men should be in China, black men in Africa, and white people in the United States. And he says, I'm race prejudiced, I guess. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. He used to brag in interviews that as his family used to get slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with. And he sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to join at one point. But the Ku Klux Klan sent the check back because he refused to fire Catholic workers in one of his businesses in Missouri. So there's no question that race played a role in his decision. How much of a role, we still debate that to this day, but I firmly believe it did play a role in his decision. And so Langston Hughes calls this out, and then his friend Zora Neale Hurston, who many argue is very apolitical throughout her life, I found a letter she wrote to Claude Barnett, her friend, in which she referred to Truman as, quote, the butcher of Asia, and was visibly upset that more African Americans were not, protesting more on this issue. But of the earliest criticism, there's no question the ones that were the most vocal was the Black Popular Front, and most notably the great W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Du Bois had likened Truman to Hitler, calling him one of the greatest killers of our day. He said what was done in Japan will, quote, set back the progress of colored nations for decades to come. Paul Robeson, who it's so sad how he's forgotten in our nation's history. My students have no idea who he is. This brilliant individual. And he went right after the colonialism issue. A year after the atomic bombings, he is in Madison Square Garden with Du Bois and others, and there's a giant rally. It's sold out. And he says, where do you think the United States is getting the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And the answer was the Belgian-controlled Congo. And he's saying, don't you see how these things are connected here, right? We're getting it from Africa, we're testing it on non-white people, and now we're using it on non-white people, right? But of course, a lot of that changes in the late 1940s and early 50s with HUAC McCarthyism and the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said it, it was Truman who put the line in the sand and said, you're either with us or you're a communist. And so a lot of groups and individuals fell mute. There was real consequences. Their lives were destroyed. And some organizations made the decision to shift to the right. Groups like the Council on African Affairs were destroyed, National Negro Congress, and the NAACP, under the directorship of Walter White, and then later Wilkins, they make the decision that they're going to shift to the right on this particular issue. That if they ally themselves with Truman on this, if they become staunchly anti-communist, even kick out their own leader in Du Bois, that this will result in civil rights legislation. And it doesn't happen, right? And Truman never delivers on that. But others did not view peace or nuclear disarmament as a bargaining chip. And what people like Du Bois and Robeson and their wives, of course, and Shirley Graham Du Bois and Aslan Robeson and others, what they saw was us threatening to use nuclear weapons in Korea now. Right? I mean, by 49, the Russians have the atomic bomb. We get the hydrogen bomb in 52. They get it in 53. The arms race is on. And here we are threatening to use it again on the people of color in Korea. And they said, not on our watch. We're not going to allow it to happen. And so coming out of Stockholm was the Ban the Bomb petition or the Stockholm Peace Pledge. Now, again, when I talk to kids today and I tell them about this, they think, well, it's no big deal because today they can just sit at their couches. They go on change.org, one click, boom, they're an activist, right? But that wasn't the case back then. To get signatures for a Ban the Bomb petition was serious business. People lost their jobs if they signed it, were deported, put in prison, physically beaten. And they went and they really tried to get the black community involved. And you got to think this is happening in the early 50s on the height of the heels of the civil rights movement, right? And they get over 2.5 million signatures. 60 million people signed it worldwide. And people like Charlie Parker and Duke Ellington and Marian Anderson were signing this petition saying, we don't care if it's communist, we don't want nuclear weapons in our country. So, it's pretty remarkable when you see the work that was going on here on this issue. And it shows that this issue was always there in this community. This idea that it is a white middle class only issue is not true. It's never been that way since 45. The LGBTQ community, various religious groups, African American community have always been involved in this issue. And so in the 1950s, especially the year of 1955, that's a real pivotal issue in both cases. Because in 55, in the summer of 55, you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. A few months later in December, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in that same year, you have the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-African Asian conference. And if you look at the Bandung Conference, which many prominent African Americans either attended or sent their regards to, the platform was very clear. They were against colonialism, they were for nuclear disarmament, and against white supremacy. And so you're seeing all these things, again, converge and start to come together. And so while the civil rights movement is happening, in the late 1950s, early 60s, the French decide that they wanted to test their first nuclear weapon to be a nuclear power. And where did the French announce they're going to test it? In Africa, in the Sahara. And this is happening during the Algerian War for Independence. This is happening when Kwame Nkrumah and Ghana is getting their independence at the same time. And many of the people in Ghana feared that the nuclear fallout would affect the cocoa industry that was for such a big piece of their economy, and wanted to stop this test. And there was an individual who saw all these connections, and that was Bayard Rustin. Now, Bayard Rustin is another person that none of my students heard of, because Bayard Rustin was gay, so he gets marginalized and iced out of the civil rights movement. And the reality is, you wouldn't have had a march on Washington without Bayard Rustin.
Right.
You know, I always tell my students, if we take everybody who is from the LGBTQ community out of Black history, you're not going to have a Black history. That's the reality of it, right? So he was so influential because Rustin puts a team together of African Americans, British activists, African activists, and goes to Africa to try to stop this test from happening, physically putting his body on the line. And not everybody was okay with that. A. Philip Randolph at the time writes to him and says, "What are you doing over there? I need you over here for the primaries against Kennedy and organizing civil rights." And Rustin writes back and says, "Don't you see how these things are connected? This is the most important work I've ever done. If this starts in Africa, look what happens to the U.S." And so, you know, they protest, and the military finally physically removes them, and the French test their nuclear weapon. But protests break out all over the continent. Nkrumah is heavily inspired and has follow-up World Without the Bomb conferences and makes this a real issue for himself. And Rustin, you know, all the way up to the day he died, said that was the most important work he had ever done. And of course, you know, I can't talk about the the role of African Americans in the anti-nuclear movement without looking at Dr. King. Dr. King, many say that Dr. King started talking about foreign policy and nuclear weapons, these things, a year to the day he died, right? April 4th, 1967, Riverside Church, literally a year to the day he died. When in Riverside Church, he gave his famous Beyond Vietnam speech and called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. But the reality is if you look at nuclear weapons specifically, he was talking about the nuclear issue a decade earlier, as early as 1957, when he made his first comments in Ebony magazine. And he consistently spoke out against nuclear weapons. You know, he would say, what does it matter if we can drink out of the same water fountain, but then, you know, we're all dead from nuclear war? Right. What does it matter if we fight for integration, but we're concerned about the world in which you're trying to integrate? That makes no sense. And where is King learning a lot of this from? His wife, of course, right? Coretta Scott King was a long-seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She was a member of Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. And November 1st was the anniversary of the creation of Women's Strike for Peace. Well, Coretta Scott King was a member of Women's Strike for Peace. And for Coretta Scott King and so many other Black women that were in this movement, they had to deal with internal racism in these movements. So in Women's Strike for Peace, they didn't want to add race to this discussion, these white middle-class women. And so, you know, there was at one point in Detroit, there was a national conference, and the Black members, the women wanted to have signs that said desegregation or disintegration. And the white members said no. It's Coretta who actually had to kind of broker the deal there, right? It's Coretta who influences King to start talking about the triple evils of militarism and capitalism, right? And racism. So these things are all there throughout the civil rights movement. Somebody like Lorraine Hansberry, you know, Lorraine Hansberry, she saw more than just a raisin in the sun. And of course that would be enough, but she was more than that. She was a socialist, a feminist, and she was an anti-nuclear activist. Great book that just came out called Radical Vision on her, phenomenal book on her. And, she famously goes into a movie about Hiroshima and comes out of the theater and says, no more Hiroshimas, not now, not ever. Her last play, actually, before she died, is about a nuclear Holocaust and what happened to the two people that survived. So this was something that was, always on her radar, but we don't think about that because we want to compartmentalize people. We want to just say this is who they are and that's it. And that's just simply not the case. Again, during the Vietnam War, the Black Panther Party, for example, Black Panther Party, if you read Executive Mandate number 1 that Bobby Seale read at Sacramento Courthouse in 1966 when they formed, it explicitly connects what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And I asked Bobby about that, and I said, did you do it intentionally? He said, of course we did. We always saw ourselves in an international context and, connecting this. And it's why Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen and others spoke in Japan about this issue and were invited to speak there. So it was there through the 1960s. In the 1970s, when a lot of people are suffering from PTSD, or they're just simply exhausted, they've gone through so much in the 60s. Again, this issue is there because you have, when Jimmy Carter comes in, he announces he's going to build another nuclear weapon called the neutron bomb. Well, who is the person that talks to him constantly about abandoning this and scrapping this? His UN ambassador. Who was that? Andrew Young. Dr. King's right-hand man to the civil rights movement.
Wow.
Who was the one talking about apartheid on South Africa when they had a nuclear weapons program secretly being built with Israel? Andy Young, right? So you see that. You also see it in the Congressional Black Caucus. Yeah. For years in the 70s and 80s, it was the Congressional Black Caucus that was the leaders on this fight. Where are they now, right? They were the leaders on this fight. And so, when we look at the 1980s, the height, if you will, of the anti-nuclear movement kind of reaches its zenith in the 80s. And that's because, Reagan comes in, and Reagan announces he's going to spend $180 billion now on nuclear weapons and modernization and more military by cutting social spending by $140 billion, programs that largely affected the Black community. And so the economics piece, people started connecting and saying, why are we spending all this money on nuclear weapons? We already have enough to end the world multiple times over. And we are suffering here in the Black community. And so the movement gained steam again in the 1980s. And so, in the 1980s, there were so many different groups. When I was writing this book, I got contacted by a gentleman. He said, I need to talk to you about, what you're researching. And so we met up, and his name was Greg Johnson. And him and his wife at the time, he was a librarian, African-American librarian at Georgetown. And him and his wife cared deeply about this issue. And when they reached out to the white peace groups, they got the brush off. They said, no, your community doesn't care about it. So the two of them, with a rotary phone, one fax machine, one flyer, they started a group called Blacks Against Nukes. And it grew to hundreds of members, multiple chapters. They were featured in Black periodicals. They spoke in Japan. So here were two ordinary people doing something pretty extraordinary, right? You had, I love that we have the conscious, athlete again with LeBron James and Carmelo and Mike and so many others. But when we think of socially conscious athletes, we think, of course, in history of Muhammad Ali, we think of John Carlos and Tommy Smith raising their fists in the air in 68. Mm-hmm. But there were also another group in the 80s called Athletes United for Peace. And they were African-American, they were professional athletes, excuse me, and Russian athletes, and they worked together to try to end the arms race. People like JoJo Washington, who played for the Boston Celtics, Marianne Washington, first African-American woman who was in the Olympics for basketball. Just so many athletes coming together. The entire Baltimore Orioles baseball team go to Hiroshima and start talking about this issue. So we see it coming from all different parts in the 1980s, culminating in the now famous June 12th, 1982 rally. This June will be the 40th anniversary of it. This is when 1 million people, the biggest rally in United States history for anything, came together in Central Park to demand an end to the arms race. And this is another instance where people look at this, if you kind of take an aerial shot of Central Park that day, you would think it was dominated by the white middle class. Reality was 50% of the leadership that day was African-American, led by the Reverend Herbert Daughtry and the Black United Front. There was the Third World People's Coalition. You had people like Shaka Khan and the Wailers and Rita Marley and Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee, Dick Rock. I can go on and on of how many African Americans were there that were speaking about this, that were marching. You had thousands pouring out of Bed-Stuy in Harlem. I mean, so to say that, again, that this wasn't an issue in the Black community is nonsense. And the hardest part for me writing this book at the time, because it came out in 2015, was writing about Obama. Because I knew I was going to have to address Obama, being the first Black president, of course, but he wasn't done being president. And the worst thing I could do as a historian is kind of predict something and be wrong, and it's out there for life, right? So the first thing to recognize with Obama is he certainly wasn't the first Black politician to talk about nuclear weapons and disarmament. if you go back to Jesse Jackson, and when he ran for president in 84 and 88, his platforms were far more anti-nuclear than the Democratic establishment. And he got millions of votes. You look at Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago, who was one of Obama's heroes, won multiple awards in the nuclear community for all the work he was doing on the nuclear disarmament front. One of the biggest politicians that fought for nuclear disarmament was Ron Dellums, the head of the Congressional Black Caucus out of California. I mean, Dellums was so instrumental. He actually goes to Utah and meets with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon Church, to try to convince him to tell Ronald Reagan not to build the MX missile in Utah. He was coming up with alternative budgets. He was fighting on all these fronts. So Ron Dellums is another hero in this story. And so Obama, dating back to his days as a student, he wrote about nuclear issues as a student at Columbia. As a politician, he spoke about nuclear disarmament. And when he got in office, he gives a couple months later, after he's inaugurated, the famous Prague speech in April. The Prague speech is arguably the most anti-nuclear speech any president has ever given, with the exception of President John F. Kennedy's commencement address at American University in June of 1963, dubbed the Peace Speech. And then he put together the nuclear summits, in which he brought world leaders together to try to get loose nuclear weapons materials in safe hands. And that was incredibly important. They actually got enough materials out of the Ukraine to build 4 nuclear weapons before the Ukraine fell into disarray. He also signed the New START Treaty. As somebody that travels to Japan every year during the August 6th and 9th, I remember the year I went after Obama became president. And the mayor of Hiroshima started a campaign called the Obama Majority. And I was watching all these Japanese citizens wearing Obama Majority T-shirts. And it was the first time that we allowed the U.S. ambassador to attend the ceremony, Ambassador Ruse. And I had Japanese citizens literally coming up to me and handing me stacks of letters. And they were saying, because they found out I was American, saying, send these to your president and thank him for what he's doing. It was incredible. And the most important thing I think he did as president on anything was the Iran nuclear deal that Trump trashed. Because without firing a shot, he got Iran to stop making a nuclear weapon. I certainly wasn't part of this and had no role in this, but I publicly wrote and called for him to visit Hiroshima before he left office. And to see him before he leaves office visit Hiroshima symbolically was incredible. I remember with the time difference being up at 4 a.m. with atomic bomb survivors on Skype and crying with them because it mattered to them. Now, does that mean Obama did everything I wanted? Of course not. I think he should have took nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. I think he should have not signed on $1 trillion modernization plan. I think he should have, no first use. There's a lot of things I think Obama certainly should have done.
Sure.
But I don't put that on Obama. I put that on us because he never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And if we wanted Obama to act, then we should have had 1 million strong out in the streets pushing him to act, because no president has ever acted without being pushed.
Right.
That's on us. So to wrap up, what can we learn from this history, right? I will be honest that as somebody that has fought for so long to eliminate racism and eliminate nuclear weapons, and then to have the last 4 years where we had a white supremacist in the Oval Office with the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons anytime he wanted, it would be easy for me and I have, to feel defeated that we haven't won. But I made a promise to the Hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors, long ago, that I would never stop fighting on this. For those 4 years, if you want a juxtaposition of how race plays into this, just think about, for the last 4 years, you had Trump and Putin, 2 white supremacist nationalist leaders with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. And on the other side, the unthinkable happened with the nuclear weapons ban treaty. 120 nations, most of them from the global south, people of color, no more. And signing on and ratifying, and last January it went into force, a real binding nuclear weapons ban treaty.
Great.
Where it's not just that you won't produce them or test them or use them, but you won't even financially work with countries dealing with nuclear weapons. And so, people say, well, but the nuclear powers aren't part of it, so it's a waste of time, blah, blah. Well, there was once a time where chemical weapons were viewed as okay, but they're not now. They were shamed out of existence. There was a time when landmines were used, and they are no longer shamed out of existence. And so the nuclear weapons ban treaty isn't the be-all. It's a tool that we use to push this forward. And so, we, of course, need to work for women's rights and for LGBTQ equality, and of course for Black Lives Matter, and of course for immigration rights. But as Dr. King said, again, what does it matter if we achieve this world of social justice, but we're all dead from nuclear war? And so on these particular issues, we have to understand that this isn't about the present moment, right? It's about future generations. So the true impact of our activism is not going to be felt till we're gone. And that is not a reason to fall into despair. It should motivate you. The reality is nuclear weapons and racism will be on this planet when I die. But if there are just a fewer nuclear weapons and less racism when I leave this planet than when I came into it, then that's all I can do. King said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But I would argue not unless all of us grab it and actually bend it ourselves. Thank you. I'll stop there so we can get some questions.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's awesome. Hello, everyone. I apologize for my tardiness. Thank you so much for just presenting the purpose of your book and being with us tonight and having patience with us and getting this together. I am Deidra EmEl. I'm Executive Director for the Western New York Peace Center and co-host tonight with Vicki. And I just want to thank you for your time and your efforts. I don't know, do anybody have any questions right away before I ask?
No, you go ahead. We got something.
Well, right,
Yeah,
and I didn't fully introduce Jim. Also, Jim Anderson is because we wanted to get right in, and especially we didn't want to keep anyone. But Jim is the president of Peace Action New York State. He's also with Citizen Action and just an all-round activist and leader and radio king too. He's a co-host too. But anyway, and he's the one who brought you to us.
Yes.
I mean, we've been excited for years hearing about the work you're doing and to hear your presentation, which you have been on Talking Peace before at least once.
Yeah,
I know you have.
Yeah,
it's a while. It's been quite a few years, but anyway, so
awesome. Wonderful
to hear you, and so inspiring and so difficult to so wonderful to see the solidarity, and then so I want to say as a white person, so shameful to me to see how the wisdom and the solidarity that was being offered was not understood, was ignored or rejected, or it was just again doubly and triply wrong. But when you're talking about Malcolm X and Lorraine Hansberry, Dr. King, so many our heroes and sheroes.
Yeah. Wow, I don't even know where to start because you gave so much information in so little time.
I got something for you, dude.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one of the things we just experienced, what I think is a huge teaching piece that, I mean, Vincent does this.
Yes.
But it as many times as I've heard him, seen him, been places where he is, every time I grow and it opens my eyes and my thoughts wider.
Absolutely.
The other thing I like is that he brings it forth not with you got to do it this particular way, and that he encourages you to use the lens that is your lens to see the connection.
Right.
Well, in this moment, my question to you would be, Vincent, is that this kind of topic and what needs to be done and pushing it forward, do you think it could fall into where everybody's talking about, these are socialist kinds of policy, using this term socialist to kind of knock down things, but do you think that it could fall somewhere within people expressing this kind of work as a socialist kind dimension?
So again, if you look back at the history of this, whether it was during the Black Popular Front with Du Bois and Robeson and them, were they called socialists, of course. When we had in the 1980s, the June 12th rally, was there questions, you're letting communist groups in? I think you're going to get that no matter what. So I guess you kind of got to roll with it. And you're going to get it because you're dealing with a nuclear lobby. We're talking, about a lot of money here. I'm not far from here. I remember when I went to Syracuse, New York to speak about this, and a lot of the folks in the crowd said, we agree with you. We're not in favor of nuclear weapons. But guess what? Lockheed Martin is the main employer in our town. So find me a new job. It's a jobs program, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And so, so how do you get a representative that's representing that district to then say no to this, right? So that's another piece of this. And, when we talk about the issue of race and nuclear weapons, the book deals with African Americans against the bomb, but of course this is, you mentioned, Australian Aborigines in the Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Kazakhstan, Native American lands, atomic veterans, nuclear waste with the Savannah River Project. All of this come back to race, right? Race. And when you look at, even where the money's being spent, again, a couple of years ago, I'm right near D.C., in Baltimore, they were asking the parents to buy space heaters for their kids for the heat in the classrooms because they didn't have heaters. At the same time, we're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons when we have enough to end the world. So you got to tell those parents and have those conversations so they understand, as Jim would say, why they have skin in the game. You got to talk to them about why this matters to them. It's not some abstract thing. But on the flip side of that coin, the mistake that a lot of nuclear disarmament folks make is they go into the Black community and talk at them and say to them, don't you understand this is the most existential threat of your life? But if you're Black, it's not. The most existential threat of your life is being killed by the police on the way to school, right? So you got kids that are trying not to get killed on the way to school, put food on the table, pay student loans, get an education. And now you got to save the planet from nuclear annihilation. So it's a heavy lift, but you just got to find different ways to connect with them. And one of the things that Malcolm always said was, make it plain. Malcolm could debate the best minds in the world in Oxford, but he also could reach the boy on the block. He had that crossover ability. Tupac was another one that had that ability. It's a rare ability, but that's what you got to do. You got to make it plain. You don't need to get all wonky with the nuclear stuff to get kids involved. And that's a piece that people got to learn about.
Well, I guess my question would be is why should we get involved today? What is the what helps to turn the leaf? What helps to bring, people of color, whether African American or Japanese American, whoever, what brings them back to the table? And I had another question before that was probably, where did the disconnect happen? And then I guess answer the first one, if you didn't mind.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is, in terms of why, we tried to lay that out. So there's the obvious, that doesn't matter what progress. There's only two things that can eliminate us as a species, right? Nuclear weapons and climate change. So that's the obvious one. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you can look at the economic conversion piece and the money that's being spent and where that could better be spent, right? So that's another piece. Now you also look at, again, as we're talking about people of color and how they're being affected by this. So, we've had these periods of history, whether it was Martin Delaney or whether it was Marcus Garvey, whether it was, again, the Black Arts. There's this connection, this Pan-African connection, right? Where you had even in the 80s in the golden era of hip-hop, where you had African Bambaataa and Zulu Nation, and you had Poor Righteous Teachers and BDP with the African medallions and the red, green, and black, dashiki. So that piece is somewhat missing. So when you had that, they were saying what happens in South Africa, what happens in Ghana, what happens to Native Americans directly affects us, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Right. So how do you get people? You see that level of connection with the Palestinian issue, no doubt, right? But how do you get that connection back also for that buy-in? The other thing is there's not going to be this idea that there's one message for everybody. It doesn't work. So I might connect with one kid, one person based on sports. oh, you know what? LeBron James did this, and then, this athlete did this, and boom, you're in talking about it. Somebody else, the other day, I was wearing a shirt of the hip-hop artist that just recently passed, MF Doom, right? And this kid said, I love your shirt, I love Doom. He was one of my favorites. I said, one of my favorite Doom songs is, and boom, he had multiple songs about nuclear weapons, and I was able to bring that up. He's like, oh, I didn't know he cared about that. We got in that conversation, and now he's in, right? So it's, people often also look for themselves in history. Somebody that looks like them, shares an identity with them, somebody they can relate to. For me, it was John Brown, right? So that's, again, why I tried to put this history out there. So there's multiple ways you can, maybe it's religion for some folks, right? Maybe it's somebody in their family that had cancer. Explain how cancer rates rise with nuclear radiation. So there's all different ways. There's not going to be one hook. Right? And then why has it kind of, the nuclear issue has kind of gone down, not just in the Black community, but in every community, right? You basically have seen this kind of thing, again, where climate change has kind of become the issue. Yes. But even that, why? Well, one thing is, climate change those folks knew they needed to get a win. They needed something tangible, and that was Keystone. Keystone Pipeline isn't the be-all, end-all of climate change, but it was something that everybody could rally around. Stop Keystone, fight against Keystone, standing around, same kind of thing. So when Keystone got canceled, they could say, we did this. We got this victory. A little bit tougher to do that with nuclear weapons. You start talking about ICBMs, you start talking about, again, gloss over, they have no idea, right? So simplicity is key to getting people back at the table. The 80s was the best we ever did. Well, why? Part of that was the nuclear freeze resolution. The nuclear freeze resolution was very simplistic in its nature. No testing, no production, no use of nuclear weapons. That's it. Let's freeze where we are. And that's why I think the nuclear ban treaty has legs now, because it's simplistic. You can explain that to people. No, the ban of nuclear weapons through the UN, get your city involved, get your state involved, get your country involved, and so on and so forth. So there's not going to be one way we say, if we just put our message this way, then it's all good. That's not going to work. You have to see who, because the other problem is to assume that all people of color, all their problems are the same. And that's so condescending. Right. Specific issues in the Asian community, specific issues in the Hispanic community, right? So you have to look and say, okay, how is this affecting this particular community? What is in it for them? Why would they care about this issue? And then go from there. So, I'm constantly, working. One thing we have a problem with is in the disarmament world, in the arms control world, there's not enough people that look like you that are in those positions, right? So they're not going to, you're going to be much more effective in the Black community than me. So we need also, more kids to be offered positions and scholarships and to study this, right? And one thing we do in school is we separate humanities from STEM. And I hate that, because the best minds that we've had, the Einsteins and the Steve Jobs and the Da Vinci's, they always saw that science and humanities are not mutually exclusive, that they're the same.
Absolutely.
And so somebody like me that loves history and African-American studies and does all these things, but then also I love physics, I love the science, I love the nuclear issue, they're one and the same. So I think that's another thing, is getting more and more kids, especially students of color, to realize, how they can make a difference in that regard.
I sort of wonder if maybe, as you said, the new nuclear ban and the illegality of the United States, current situation of being the largest by far holder of nuclear weapons, and also about the new generation of nuclear weapons that is just on the verge. And of course, when we have Mark Coville and coming here, who's one of the Kings Bay Plowshares for the annual dinner, he and the rest of the Kings Bay Plowshares are getting the Peace Education Award, because what kind of length have they gone to, risking 25 years incarceration to try and get people to sort of even look at this issue, because people have it seems like people have just felt like, too big to handle. So
removed, right?
Right? So, or just too big. It's just sort of like, well, what you going to do? No, we're guilty of illegal acts in this country by having all our nuclear weapons when there's a nuclear ban, and we're not even trying to reduce them. We're having a whole new generation And so I love the idea. They have some suggestions of people wearing the hazmat suits and going and saying, citizens arrest to I don't know, Lockheed Martin or up at UB if they're doing this kind of research or wherever it may be. What do you think about some of that?
You can divest, have your school divest in certain things of that nature. I think, I was in a discussion earlier today, and there's a back and forth on does fear work, that fear will backfire. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, if you look at the 80s, part of the reason that people were so involved, including the Black community, including indigenous communities, is because they were freaked out because Reagan was using such rhetoric that of a winnable nuclear war. They thought this was seriously going to happen. Right. And not only that, if you look at the amount of nuclear books that came out, films, remember the day after in 83, that scared the hell out of people, right? So imagine if we had that technology, right? There's a lot of climate change films out there, but we, one of the people that made such a dent in the 80s was Helen Caldicott. And the reason is because she went in every talk could talk about what it does to human beings, right? So, and again, that makes it more human. So I think that's another big piece of it is, we saw with Trump, his rhetoric, and then North Korea, there was a rise of awareness, a heightened awareness about all things nuclear, but it stopped because, again, I think people today are just reeling from so much with social media, right? So it's like, okay, he tweeted this out, I got a point on this front, oh wait, he just put kids in cages, and now, oh wait, he just did this, and you feel like you're just getting punched in the gut constantly. We're back in the 80s, 70s, on social media, so we had time to process things. I remember in the 80s when I was younger and the Challenger explosion happened, you had months to kind of process that and mourn it and deal with it. You don't today. It's one hook after another, and you're just like, where do I, how do I deal? So it's a lot of these kids just say, I want to divorce myself from the whole damn thing. I can't deal with it.
I was about to say, it neutralizes the impact.
Yeah. But again, I mean, it's also shouldn't, my kids as freshmen and sophomores in college should not be coming to my class, and that's the first time they're having a real discussion about what nuclear weapons do, what happened in Hiroshima, and reading John Hershey's book. That is our education system is a mess if that's how long it takes for us to get to that.
Right.
It's ridiculous. Right. That's another piece.
Well, you make me think of our camp. We do some work with kids at different ages and ways. So we have a camp. We have an after-school program that's just restarting in the new year. Yeah, Peace Jam. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to thank you again. I just can't thank you enough for joining us. And we are at our time for Talking Peace.
We have about 5 more minutes.
Is it 5 more minutes? Okay.
Yeah,
okay. I didn't want it to go.
Yeah, but we have some time. But we're getting short on time because there's so much, and there's so much.
Right.
I want to also mention when you said about Paul Robeson, because he, some people don't know about him, but those of us who do know about him, it's back to what you said. Such an activist, but also that way that everything is connected, and through the music and the arts and the science and the art are, he used his platform, he used his fame and his abilities to uplift all of our issues. And once again, we're always talking about unite the struggles or unite the visions, and connecting the dots, how it's all connected. As you were saying about the indigenous people who here, have all kinds of nuclear waste that's actually
we're still cleaning up. Yeah. West Valley and Lovejoy, area. And, nuclear waste is still being cleaned up from 50 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you got to plan.
Yeah, I know, Steve. I've heard multiple times that Steve McQueen, the director of 12 Years a Slave, was toying with the idea of doing a biopic on Paul Robeson. I got to hope he does.
That would be wonderful.
It would be.
Yeah.
We need to really start getting some plans and try and get you here in Buffalo. I mean,
yes, we do.
The beauty is that your book.
The book
all the videos out there is such huge in teaching, even in one's own ranks of a different social issue, because all your talks connected, and it's
Right.
sort of like, it's like when I think of CPR, it's sort of like CPR brings you back alive, and
Right.
like it awakens you.
Rejuvenating, right.
When you read Vincent's book, and when you hear Vincent's talk at the depth that he just did here, I mean, that's what it's like. It awakens us, and again, it's not saying do it like this. It
Right.
awakens us to use those things we could use by
We're searching
connecting
for
what he did.
ourselves.
Right.
It is just powerful. So I thought I'd say that yeah, we can do him by tape, but we need to plan to have him here because there's like magic anywhere I've been where he
Most
is.
definitely.
Thank you, Vincent.
That's what I'm saying. I can't say thank you enough. You know,
It's
just
so
so
ins-
information.
It's
Yeah.
so inspiring, because the people that you're mentioning are our biggest heroes and sheroes, in so many ways, because they had the wisdom, they had the love. Really, they had that deep love and that deep solidarity, so that they saw how all those issues are connected, and how the oppression and the white supremacy, how the colonial, the empire built, the empire
Imperialism.
and the white supremacy was connected, along with the militarism and the
That's
racism. As Dr. King said, as Malcolm said, as so many people, and as you said, so many artists too.
I know you said it just a few minutes, but Vincent, here's something I want to tell you that I utilize based on reading your book and your talk. And that is, he talked, when he was talking about Dr. King and when he spoke and how those who spoke back against you, when I talk today, I used to, that is the point where we went off the rail, where we're seeing the connection of the economics and as well as the human tragedy in war.
Yes.
And we not being able to see it, but also add to it that, as you mentioned, how not only LBJ but others don't like it when you find this, as long as you make them look good, but challenging some of the political things that they're in. I said that was one of the things that helped some of these black organizations go off the road. It's because you go to the other one and say, hey, you got to stop that Vincent guy. If he's going to mess up, I'm trying to get you something. And that helped to turn the tide against him.
That's true.
And
Oh yeah, when Martin was asking for use the same water fountain, he was everybody's liberal darling. The moment he started now calling out questioning capitalism in Vietnam, now
That's
he's public enemy number one.
That's
and
right.
everybody, even members of the black community turned on him, right?
That's right.
And when people look at Malcolm and they say, well, at the end of his life, his attitude started shifting a little bit towards white, and they go, oh, chalk went up for Martin. Malcolm was moving closer to him. They're wrong. It's actually the opposite. By the end of Martin's life, he was starting to move closer to Malcolm. He was questioning the liberals in the North. He was questioning nonviolence. He was questioning, and he was moving towards a socialistic thought process. So there's no question they would have linked up, but he was moving. He understood that actually Malcolm was right.
yes, indeed.
I just want to quote one of our beloved local young activists, that is John Washington, and I just quoted him in an effort that we're making to work on some of this, and he said, we pay with our lives. He's talking about black people. We pay with our lives, we pay with our families, and we pay because the check Martin Luther King died trying to cash is still marked insufficient funds.
There you go.
So we got a lot of work to do, but we're doing it. And with your clarity and that historic view, and that inspiring view of what people have done, what people can do, what we've been on the verge of, and what we need to do. It's very inspiring.
And very plain, I would say.
Yes.
You made it plain, and help make those connections. And I really love that you brought out a lot of the women and wives of the known activists, that they were activists in their own right in themselves, and we can't underestimate the power of influence.
So actually now we are out of time. I'm just looking at the clock. So if you want to just
Yeah, so thank you all for watching Talking Peace with Vincent Intondi. Read his book, African Americans Against the Bomb. And thank you so much again, and until next time.
Thanks a jillion.
Peace and power, Vincent.
Yes, amen. Thanks so very much.
Thank you. I was like,
Wow.
dinner.
No, you were just right.